Welcome to Timeline Iran. I'm Babak Kalhor. We have in studio today Professor Afshin Matin-Asgari. He specializes in 20th century Middle East, modern Iran, also modern Islamic political and intellectual movements. Dr. Matin-Asgari was born in Tehran, Iran, and moved to the U.S. after high school. In the U.S., he participated in the student movement against Iran's monarchist regime. He returned to Iran in 1978 during the revolution that overthrew the monarchy, but he did not support the post-revolutionary regime and returned to the US. At Cal State LA, he teaches courses in Middle Eastern history, world history, Islam, and comparative religion. He's published numerous books, articles, and book chapters. Two of his books that we kind of recommend for you to read is important about the Iranian student opposition to the Shah and both Eastern and Western, an intellectual history of modern Iranian history. Welcome, Ustad. Glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much.
Part of what we discuss in this podcast is the political landscape of Iran beginning in the 20th century and how it shaped the quagmire we're in today. One of the reasons that we did this is to shed light on the counter-narrative, because the narrative in our history has always been dictated by whoever's ruling at the time, whether it was the Qajars or Reza Shah or the Shah or the Islamic Republic. And this landscape consists of, roughly speaking, monarchy, religious movements, and the left, and the political left, which is, it's a word we throw around easily, but it consists of a lot of different groups and ideologies. And I'm so glad to have you here to explain to us this important aspect of our political thought, which resonates in every part of our politics today, yet we know so very little about it and we discuss it so rarely. So I think this is a very important discussion we're having here today. We want to start with today and see what's there, and we want you to take us through the last, the 20th century and explain to us how we got here. So how would you explain what entails the political left in Iran? What does it consist of? Explain the ideological and political diversity of the left, as you call it, the many shades of red in your new work.
Yes, thank you. Well, at the moment in Iran, a parliamentary election is coming up, election to the Majlis, and there's a lot of complaint that the range of who can participate in politics is getting tighter and tighter. Even regime insiders are being purged. So political activity, organized activity outside of that circle is almost impossible. So there isn't a left party, there isn't a left organized presence. So you can't talk of an Iranian left that has a tangible presence at the moment right now, like we don't have liberal parties or pretty much any other kind of independent political activity. And we have to admit that the Iranian left has suffered a historical defeat after the revolution, as the left everywhere internationally. With fall of the Soviet Union, 1980s. Now there is some kind of a revival of the left internationally, including even in the US. But that is, again, if you look at the US, again, we don't have a left party. On the other hand, I think in Iran also there is a potentiality for what we may broadly could call left. There are a lot of intellectuals, students, civil society activists that we could see as the left. Some of them are active in cyberspace, but I see it as, at the present, more of a potential as an actual political presence. And that's why its history is important. If you look at other countries around Iran, again, you don't see really leftist political presence, except perhaps for Turkey. You have the People's Democratic Party, that is a small leftist coalition of leftist trends, and it functions under a lot of duress, but it can manage to pull out like 10-15% of the national vote, and that's significant. I think if we have the possibility of some kind of semi democratic politics, I think the Iranian left has that potential to at least start with that much of presence, and that's significant. With 10% of the vote, you can turn elections in coalition with other parties. So it's difficult to answer that question precisely, but to summarize what I want to say, I think at this moment, the left is a potentiality than an actual presence.
Let's go back to the beginning and see how we got here. You talked about historical revisionism, about rewriting certain aspects of Iranian history as far as how we look at the left. Let's start from the beginning, the constitutional movement. We talk about the disconnect of the left with the people, and part of this narrative goes into how they obstructed constitutionalism from going forward. Talk about the constitutional movement in and how it began, how it coincided with the creation of the political left. Explain to us a little bit about this aspect of it.
Yes, what we can call the left, and I use this term very broadly. So the first thing people think when you say the left, they think communism. But not just in Iran, but including Iran, the left has had a much broader meaning. There have been socialists, social democrats, Islamic leftists, Islamic socialists, Islamic Marxists, left nationalists, left liberals. So I would include all of them in a broad definition of the left. But we have to go back to precisely the beginning of the constitutional revolution to have some kind of a tangible, identifiable presence of the left in Iran, and that is a social democratic movement. And we have to remember that internationally, the left was largely associated with social democracy in Europe, outside of Europe. And in Iran, this is connected to the Caucasus region, Azerbaijan, that was taken by the Tsarist regime from the Qajar Iran. And so it was technically, there's Iranian Azerbaijan, and to the north of it is the Russian Azerbaijan. And in what was at that time Russian Azerbaijan, precisely, or more accurately, in Baku, that is in early 20th century or even late 19th century, a hub of the Industrial Revolution because of oil. There are thousands of workers, including migrant Iranian workers. And there is a lot of social democratic activity there. And in early 20th century, around 1904, 1905, sources tell us that a branch of that becomes the social democratic semi-organized movement in Iran. Now that coincides almost precisely with the beginning of what is called the constitutional revolution. And I think there is another confusion there, is that we have a constitutional movement in Iran that agitates for a constitution. And exactly what this constitution would be is also not clear. It becomes clear as soon as the Shah at the time, Muzaffar ad-Din Shah, accepts to have some kind of a majlis. And then the question becomes, what are the powers of this majlis? Are we going to have a written constitution? Is it going to be a majlis shorai milli? What about Islam, or is it an Islamic majlis? So what is called the constitutional revolution is a process that unfolds in stages. And once a constitution is granted, and the first Majlis, which is both a constituent assembly and the first Majlis or parliament of Iran, is formed in 1906, and we have a written constitution, but no revolution has taken place in terms of like massive popular participation or the civil war that follows. So we have a constitutional movement, and before it gets into its revolutionary stage, we have evidence of small social democratic, I don't think we can even call it an organization, but cells that are active and are mixed in with those who want to give this constitution a more democratic or progressive content. And then we have a more clear social democratic presence once this movement becomes revolutionary. If you want me to just continue, what happens is Muhammad Ali.
This is kind of what I wanted to ask you. You talk about the secular, more democratic, liberal nature of a lot of these movements, and how it has been historically, it has kind of been whitewashed into being the left is kind of can coincide with Islam at the same time, and you say that it wasn't so. It was a lot of more modern thinking, more secular thinking of these groups. And you talk about Brown, of how he kind of criticized him for creating this similarity between the left that existed and the ideas that existed, just to kind of make it comparative to Islam at that time, make it politically expedient. But explain the radicalization of this group and how it did lead to the civil war, how this was the ideas that this group contained were what pushed this so far along.
Yes, no, that's a very important question. So in 1906, Iran has a written constitution, and so it's a constitutional regime or government. And the first Majlis or parliament is convened. There's no universal suffrage. It's people vote by restriction and by orders. But that's a radical breakthrough. Nothing like that had existed in Iranian history. Now, something like that has existed across the border in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had a constitution in 1876. And we have to remember Ottoman constitutionalism as really the model for Iranian constitutionalism. That is also something that is not enough recognized. People imagine that Iran just like copied the British. The British never had a constitution, or the Belgian constitution. But I think it's important to look at Ottoman constitutionalism as a direct model for Iranian constitutionalists. And that's important because Ottoman constitutionalism was deliberately made compatible with Islam. That's a big issue. And this was the same in Iran. Those who agitated for a constitution in Iran before it was granted, people like Mahkum Khan, people like Mustashar Dole, they insisted that constitutionalism has no conflict with Islam. In fact, original Islam has been constitutionalist or even republican. So we have this one confusion is this attempt. You could think it's well-meaning because you want to make something that is not really ideas that are not of Iranian origin and are in fact secular. You want to make them compatible with a culture that is very much intertwined with Islam, and the Iranian clergy are also very powerful. You don't want them as your enemies, as you may want to win some of them over by telling them, look, this is not, Sharia laws are going to remain in place, but we're going to have also outside the Sharia domain, we're going to have a realm of secular laws that are not going to be contradictory to Islam. And in fact, this is added to the Iranian constitution, that a committee of 6 high-ranking mujtahids is going to oversee any laws that are passed, like a Supreme Court, to make sure that are all compatible with Islam. And this is added to the 1906 Constitution. So the entanglement with Islam is something that is there. And in the long run, this becomes very problematic. But we have to remember that even the social democrats call themselves mujahideen. And this is not just the Iranian social democrats. The Baku social democrats also use that name. The mujahideen is an Islamic Quranic term. Social democracy has nothing to do with that. But to make this more palatable, they begin this ironic practice that is similar to the Shi'i practice of taqiyya, dissimulation, hiding your true intentions and passing them as something more conservative. So what happens is, you mentioned Brown. Edward Brown is a British Orientalist, very well informed about Iranian history and literature, very intimately familiar with Iran. And he writes in 1909, 1910, it's actually published in 1910, a history of, it's called the Persian Revolution. So in its title, Orientalists and Europeans still call Iran Persia. And so the title of his book, which many historians agree is the first narration of the constitutional revolution. And it's written as it's unfolding. It's very influential. He has written it for a British audience. It's in English and it's for British readers. And Brown's intention is to, as much as he can, bring the British to the side of supporting and defending Iranian constitutionalism, because he knows that in 1907, the British and the Russian governments have come to an agreement. The infamous 1907 agreement. It's not just about Iran, it's about a range of issues, but when it comes to Iran, they have decided to divide Iran into zones of Russian influence in the north and British influence in the south. There's going to be a middle ground in between, which they jointly would supervise. And the implication of this agreement is that in terms of a war, then they would occupy these zones, which is exactly what happens during World War I. Brown wants to, as much as he can, and he can't do very much. In the end, he's not successful. He wants to have the British be on the side of Iranian constitutionalism. So he wants to tell the British that, look, Iran is not this kind of backward country that needs our kind of dominion. It's a country that has made a revolution, and it's people have national consciousness. In that book, he makes two quite innovative arguments. Neither one of them is in fact true. So he's in this kind of situation where he has good intentions, but he creates a lot of confusion. And he's not alone. He is he's not on the spot. His sources are people like Hassan Taqizadeh, constitutionalist activist, who, by the way, happen to be also social democrats. They're members of a Democrat party that is formed in the second Majlis. I get to that in a second. But Brown and his Iranian sources tried to pass the constitutionalist movement and even its revolutionary phase as fully compatible with Islam. And in order to do that, then they have to hide the significant presence of socialists, of Babis, of heterodox movements and individuals, and they have to amplify the presence of those with Islamic credentials and the ulama, the clergy, because they want to say, look, this movement is Islamic. Iran is an Islamic country, and what has happened is natural and normative to Iran. They also, this is Brown then, arguing that this is also a movement that revives Iran as a nation. Now, the idea of Iran as a nation is an innovation. The word they use for the nation, and this also appears in the constitution, is millat. Before that, under the Qajar, the Qajar domain is known as Mamalik Mahruse Qajar. Mamalik is plural. The protected domains of Iran, or the protected domains of the Qajar. So there is a recognition of what the Qajar Shahs are ruling is not a singular entity, definitely not a nation in the modern European sense. Whereas the word millat in Iran and also in the Ottoman Empire refers to a religious community. So there's the Shi'i millat, Shi'i. Millat Iran as a unitary entity, as a nation, is an innovative idea. And it's not just Brown. Those who, like ardent nationalists like Ahmad Kasravi, Muhammad Ali Furughi, others, they all agree that an Iranian nation does not yet exist. It must be constructed. It's something to aspire to. And historians usually agree that the constitutional revolution is the beginning of the project of nation state building or formation in Iran.
And please also explain the connotation of millat in like Islamic society as well. Kind of creates a little confusion there between nationhood and Islamic society, which carries through to today.
Through to the present, millat in Qajar Iran and also in the Ottoman Empire, they have 500 years of this, the Ottomans. It means a religious community. It's a little bit clearer to see it in the Ottoman case because there's a millat, an Islamic millat, which are the Muslims. Most of them are Sunnis, but there's a Shia minority. Then there are non-Muslim millats. The Greek Orthodox are a millat. Armenians are a millat. And so it's not a nation. That means a religious community. And these millats have some kind of internal autonomy. They run their affairs themselves. Ultimately, they're under Ottoman rule and Ottoman law. It prevails over their millat laws. But internally, they're autonomous. They run their own affairs and they have their own laws. And so Iran is a huge majority Muslim. The non-Muslims are a tiny minority. That has been, by the way, kind of imposed in time. The number of non-Muslims were larger. But when the Safavids imposed by force Shiism, they had a policy that was very different. Compared to the Safavids, the Ottomans were much more tolerant. In Iran, with the coming of the Safavids, the official policy of the Shahs, so if you want to call them the government, was that not only all of their subjects are Muslims, except small exceptions were made for Armenians, but they were tiny. But you have to be also a Shi'i Muslim. So that is the kind of confusing background. But with the constitutional revolution, then millat has to mean something else. It has to correspond to something like nation as it's understood in Europe. That's what Brown implies. And he creates another layer of confusion. I'm not blaming Brown alone for all of these things, but these are like the contradictions and confusions of nationalism, and Iran is not alone in kind of fabricating an imaginary past for modern nationhood. Brown argues that ancient Iran has been also a nation in ancient times, under even pre-Islamic times, and this becomes part of Iranian nationalism, that there is something like an Iranian nation that has existed for not hundreds but thousands of years, and goes back to the time of Cyrus. And this is completely false, because those were empires, and they had no kind of national cohesiveness. The idea that ancient Iran, the term appears under the Sasanians for the first time, and it means an empire. It would be like Rome or China. So all of these issues have to be worked out, and they're an agenda, they're a project that needs definition, and so is the word revolution that all of a sudden is used here. Revolution in the old Iranian sense relates to changes in the weather, or putting things back in an old order. This idea that the revolution is a political breakthrough to a new arrangement of society is completely new, but it does happen in fact, and that is the turning of the constitutional movement into a constitutional revolution. It happens as a reaction, because when Muhammad Ali Shah, the prince, becomes king, his father, who had signed the constitutional decree, dies. The young prince, who's a hothead autocrat, takes over, and it's complicated exactly how he gets to that point, but he was an autocrat, and he was looking for an opportunity to put an end to this nonsense. And he has the backing of his big brother, the Russian Tsar, who just at that exactly the same time had put down the first Russian Revolution of 1905. And so Muhammad Ali Shah uses his Cossack armies, and that's the army that is officered by Russians, and a Russian general is at his head. So he unleashes the Cossacks on the Majlis, declares an end to constitutionalism. By this time, the Iranian clergy is divided. Some of them are adamantly opposed to constitutionalism. They say this is against Islam, has nothing to do. They get it. They get this true drift. Some try to say, well, no, there could be some compatibility. Let's work on like a middle ground solution. But what happens is this Shah overthrows constitutional government and is finished. There's only like one city in the entire country, and that's the city of Tabriz, that resists the Shah's coup d'etat through forming a militia. And a militia is you armed ordinary people. And ordinary people are not fighters, they're not soldiers. They're not going to be able to stand up to these Cossacks, but they get help. And the significant help comes from across the border, from the Caucasus, and these are Armenians, Georgians, a few Russians, and Azeris from the northern Azerbaijan, from Russian Azerbaijan. These are experienced fighters, and they know how to use weapons, they know how to use bombs, they know how to fight, and they bring arms and experience, and these are the ones who boost the resistance of Tabriz. The local leaders are the famous ones we know, Sattar Khan, Bagher Khan, but everything is organized by an invisible center, Markaz Ghaibi. And this Markaz Ghaibi is the coordinating committee of Tabriz resistance, and it's social democratic. It's dominated. These experienced fighters who come are social democrats, and this is how they make a very significant intervention in saving constitutional government. They are ultimately defeated, but they resist long enough so that there are other constitutionalist centers elsewhere in Iran, most importantly in Gilan. And again, in Gilan too, Social Democrats are in the lead of organizing these popular militias. And there is another cavalry from the south, the Bakhtiyaris. So the militias of Azerbaijan, the militias of Gilan, and the Bakhtiyari cavalry converge on Tehran. And now this is a civil war. It's no longer a movement that agitated for the constitution. They overthrow a king who's sent into exile. He tries to come back, but he's defeated a second time. And so by 1909, 1910, then constitutionalism is restored, but through a revolutionary movement that has won a civil war. And in that movement, social democrats, their numbers are small. And many of them are not necessarily Iranian. Their numbers are not very large. Those who came across the fighters are only in the hundreds. But you see the significance of these people in people like Yeprem Khan. He is an Armenian, and yet he is a constitutionalist, revolutionary, military leader. And so when you have the restoration of the constitution, a revolution at least has begun, and Iranian constitutionalism gets involved with a revolutionary movement. In that movement, the Social Democrats play an important role. And in 1910, you have Iran's first political party that calls itself Ejtemaiyun Ammiyun. And that's a direct translation of social democratic. Ijtimai means social. Ammi is a word that they were searching for a word that would make sense in Persian and correspond to something like democratic or popular, populist.
I want to get into that and the comparison between that and the social moderates and the confusion before that. But getting back to the period that you just talked about, between this revolution that happened, these groups, you explained what role Russia played on one half of this. Of course, this was an internal movement of people and liberation, but it doesn't exist in the vacuum of what's going on between Russia and Britain. And I wanted to know your take on this. We know Russia's position on this constitutional movement and revolution and creation of this constitution. But what was the British take on this, from supporting of the Ba'ath to kind of indirect support of this? And when did they stop their support, and how did that affect this movement? And what did that rivalry between Russia and Britain, how did that play into this?
Yes, no, that's a very good question. Russia was known, and nobody expected anything from Russia except for being reactionary, supporting Qajar absolutism, which is exactly what they did. The forces that defeated Tabriz were Russian forces. The Tsar sends his troops and to destroy the Iranian Revolution, and they tried their best to do that. Now, the British position, as you say, is more complicated because they were seen at least partly, if not supportive, at least less hostile to something like a constitutional change in Iran. And that is precisely what people like Brown were trying to appeal to. The difficulty with that is exactly at about this time, the British hit dirt in Iran, and oil begins to become an important determining really factor in their foreign policy and policy towards Iran, because they had an oil concession. And right at about this time, it's clear that the British Navy is switching from coal to oil, and oil is the most important commodity in the whole empire, and Iran's oil is that's at the top of that. Abadan, the British built this. This is for themselves. They built the world's largest oil refinery. And so the paramount concern in Iran is the protection of that concession.
As opposed to protecting their British India colonies, using Iran as a buffer. This was a kind of change in strategy.
Iran used to be a buffer. Now it's still a buffer, But in addition to that, southern Iran is enormously important to the interests of the British Empire because of oil. And so from this point on, concern with oil becomes a paramount issue for the British Empire. And this continues with the oil nationalization being intolerable to the British later on. So, as great powers do, they have to look at the real interests, which in this case are vital. Without Iranian oil, the British Empire would have become much weakened if it had any chance of survival. And so, whatever sympathies any of them had for Iranian constitutionalism had to take second place to their vital interest in Iran as a buffer zone. They didn't want, of course, the Russians to swallow all of it. They wanted to protect at least something in the south as their sphere of influence, and also in that sphere, oil was paramount.
Take us back to 1910, before the eve of the World War One, and what was happening with the Majlis in Iran and the constitutional movement of the Social Democrats.
Right. Here, I think the role of social democrats become much more important and well documented. It is both in Iran, historians who write in Persian and a few historians who have written works in English have noticed this, but somehow it does not seem to change very much the perception of the constitutional revolution, how it unfolded. And I think it ignores the very important role that social democracy played in establishing Iran's first modern political party, Ijtimaiyun Amiyun, which called itself the Democrat Party. Its official name was Social Democrat, Ijtimaiyun Amiyun, but they came to be known as Democrats. Now, why are they important? Because they had a program, and the program was more or less a translation of European social democracy's program.
Tell us the important tenets of that.
The important tenets, one important tenet is they were committed to parliamentary government. This is what people do not usually associate with the left. The first stage of the Iranian left, because it was aligned with European social democracy, is a commitment to parliamentary government, and they're the ones who want universal suffrage. They don't want voting to be only by orders. They want every Iranian individual to have an equal vote, and at first they even want women to have the right to vote. On that, they quickly give up because all of this faces a very strong pushback from the right and especially from the clergy, most of them who are now very conservative, and they're pushing back against this. Other things that they insist on are party politics. They form their own party, and immediately a conservative party is formed in reaction to them, the social moderate party, Ijtimaiyun E'tidaliyun. And this is very important because not only is party politics in its modern sense originated in Iran with social democrats, even conservative political activism begins with a reaction to that. And the conservatives basically, this is ironic and in a sense funny, because they say we too are socialist. And they say that. They say, well, look, there are Buddhist socialists, because they can see that socialism is an idea that has a project, it has cachet, and they don't have any other model to follow. This is an irony of the situation that constitutionalism is sometimes associated with the liberal tradition. But unfortunately, I wish we had that, but we don't have a liberal party. We don't have outstanding kind of liberal thinkers who come forward and offer a program at that time. We have the Social Democrats, who are the champions of parliamentary government, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. They also advocate, very importantly, they have an eye to the social aspect of this revolution. And Iran is a largely agrarian country. Interestingly, the Social Democrats right in the middle of the Tabriz civil war. These are Iranian social democrats and Armenian social democrats working together. And by being social democratic, their argument is it doesn't make any difference. We are internationalists. They don't insist. The idea of Armenian activists are already into nationalism. They have two main parties and they're both nationalistic, one more left-wing, one more just nationalist. But they see their participation in the Iranian Revolution. They're participating in the Young Turk Revolution, and they're participating in the Russian Revolution, and they're participating in the Iranian Revolution. And to these people, it's all the same, because socialists are supposed to be internationalists. This question has not exactly been worked out as to how can you be at the same time nationalist and internationalist. But my point is, these Tabriz social democrats, in the middle of the civil war, before they won it, they're debating as to what is the meaning of this revolution in Iran we're involved in, and what should be our role in it. And they have two views. One group thinks Iran is not even a capitalist country. We can't talk about socialism. Socialism is something that is supposed to come after capitalism. Another group, maybe you can call them like the more leftist of the left, they would say, yes, but we don't have to stop organizing the poor and the working class and the incipient working class that Iran has. And somehow, even though Iran is not yet a capitalist country, class politics matters, and we have to organize the lower classes. And interestingly, they write a letter to the teacher of European socialism, Karl Kautsky, the leader of Germany's Social Democratic Party, internationally recognized as the leading theorist of socialism. At that time, he's ahead of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in terms of recognition and influence. So these, from Tabriz, they write to Kautsky and say, we have these two views. Are we supposed to work for an Iran that is become a bourgeois democratic country in the future, and then we work for socialism? Or can we start to take measures right now to organize the lower classes to see how far we can go? His answer is, he cautions them against agitating a radical agrarian revolution. But in the end, this is interesting, they don't listen to him. The majority decide not to listen to Kautsky, which is interesting. It testifies to their independence of mind. They decide for themselves. At the same time, they write to the Russian Social Democrat. Plekhanov is still more of a figure internationally recognized than Lenin. They ask him to, but in the end, they're on their own. You know, they decide for themselves. They can't exactly figure it out.
And they never solve it.
They never solved it.
And this becomes one of the major points that holds back the kind of the complete left in Iran in the further years with Mirza Kuchak Khan and, not being able to decide, are we completely there to the left, or do we want to kind of exist with the current status quo? Right.
We have a revolution because clearly you overthrew a government in a civil war, you mobilized people, you armed them, you marched on the capital, you kicked out the Shah. Revolution has won, but what kind of a revolution is this, and what should it do? That's why the role of Social Democracy and the Democrat Party is important, because they say, here, we have a program. And the program doesn't call for a radical overthrow of the existing, social, gender, class hierarchies, but even the kind of measured reforms it proposes are radical for Iranian society. And that's why they also ask for agrarian reform. Now, they don't say exactly what you go and expropriate land and distribute it between the peasants. It's not clear, but what is clear is they are attentive to the question that Iran is an agrarian country. Land ownership is heavily kind of concentrated in a social class. That class you may call is the country's ruling class, and something needs to be done about that. So that's why I've said that the program that the Social Democrats proposed in 1909, 1910, this is their party program. They also publicized this in the leading periodical of Iran at that time. The organ of the Democrat Party is called Iran and No. And in it, they're quite innovative. All of the major influential newspapers of that time, Iran and No, another one arguably more important is Surah Israfil. They're all socialist and left-leaning, and they try. Surah Israfil at first is not so much worried about this, but a pushback makes it try to change its vocabulary to be more Islamic. But they are socialist, and they show attention to journalism and what you could call introducing the new vocabulary and language of modern politics. First through journalism, and then gradually later on through works of like poetry, fiction. And the social moderates basically say, they even appeal to European socialists. They say, well, look, in Europe, there are evolutionary socialists, there are revolutionary socialists. There is the school of Edward Bernstein, who has gone against Marx's revolutionary socialism and has said socialism should come through evolutionary measures and through the parliamentary road. And socialism basically means a series of social reforms. The ultimate goal doesn't matter. It's just important to be on that path. And the social moderates said, yes, that's what we like. So what they're doing basically is saying, we are socialists like you guys, but let's just take it easy and go step by step. And what is their defense? Their defense is socialism should be compatible with Islam. Islam respects private property. Islam says women have certain rights and no more. Islam says you cannot, the idea of leveling things is contrary. We need order. So that is the appeal of the social moderate party. So these ideas, you could say, are new and innovative. And yes, they haven't reached the people, because first of all, most of them are illiterate. They don't live in Tehran. They don't read these newspapers. In time, they could have had more circulation, but unfortunately, everything comes to a halt when Russia, again, here we go, it's the Russians. In 1911, 1 year after all of these proposals are put on the table, the second Majlis is functioning. So this idea that constitutionalism in Iran failed because it was not compatible with Iranian culture or history, that is not true. It doesn't fail. It stopped because of foreign imperialist intervention. The Tsar sends his troops into northern Iran. He gives an ultimatum to the Majlis to expel Morgan Schuster, who's an American hired as a private individual, financial advisor, to put Iran's affairs in order. And the Russians say, no, you can't hire a foreign advisor without our approval. And even though Iranians expel basically Schuster, they tell him, okay, you leave. That's not enough. And the Tsar sends his troops according to the agreement with the British that we can interfere in northern Iran. So basically, the northern part of the country is under occupation.
And they bomb the Majlis.
The Majlis is attacked, and because the constitutional government is effectively suspended. And within a few years, the war breaks out in 1914. Now, interestingly, in the first Majlis, the Democrat Party, the Social Democrats, Ijtimaiyun Amiyun, are a minority. They're a minority, but it's the minority that has the initiative. It has a program, it has traction, political journals are social democratic. And the proof of that is that in the third Majlis, which convenes in 1914, right on the eve of the First World War. Not the Democrats have a majority. They become a majority party, but the problem is Iran has lost its independence. So even though, let's say, during the war years, what remains of an Iranian constitutional government is Democrat-dominated, so in other words, social democratic party dominated, the country is not independent, and constitutionalism is suspended effectively. And these Democrats and their allies, Democrats as the leading party and their allies, social moderates, they decide at some point that the government in Tehran is, because when the war breaks out, then Iran is occupied not just by the Russian armies, by Ottomans also invade, and the British advance from the south also. Everybody is going to grab a part of the country as they can. And the British and the Russians are fighting the Ottomans.
Besides that, Professor, explain to us the state of affairs, what's going on the ground in Iran. This is an important part of what comes after, which is the 1919 proposal, and then 1921 with the coup, and 1925 with Reza Khan and Reza Shah, which is all reform in Iran, which is bringing back Iran to a complete nation state and cleaning up the mess. Let's see what the mess was. You talk about foreign forces, the Ottomans, the British, and the Russians. We've heard from other speakers that have told us, there was no road system, you couldn't travel, there was no safety, there was bandits. Iran was a failed state. Now, the narrative, and you proposed a counter-narrative, the narrative says that Iran was a failed state all the way up until 1921, when Reza Khan came and restored order. But part of what your thesis is that, yes, there was this breakdown, there was this disorder and anarchy, but yet there evolved certain pockets of resistance and organization. That's where you differ from the regular narrative of this was complete chaos. Explain to us that, and particularly the Khiyabani movement, the Jangali movement, what's going on in Khorasan, and how that nascent movement, those tiny movements, they never got a chance to flourish, and they've been kind of eradicated from our history, except saying there was a Khiyabani movement which Reza Shah put down, and there was a Pesian movement, Jangali movement, and they were gone. But explain to us how we went from that disorder to that kind of order, and what we understand is these were supported by the Soviets and the communists, and they failed. Take us through that, please.
Yes, this is a very complicated and confusing period of Iranian history, and strangely, it's very little studied. Those crucial 10 years between the effective suspension of the Constitution, 1911 to 1921, it's a decade. And that decade is, yes, it's very chaotic, it's very destructive. Iran does not have a functioning central government, it's occupied.
We don't even know how many people died during that period.
We don't know how many people died. The influenza, Spanish flu, epidemic breaks out, and several million people die from that. People die from starvation and famine. Part of the famine is because these foreign armies are requisitioning food, and nobody ever pays any kind of indemnity to Iran after the war for the damages they inflicted during the war.
And part of it is our own hoarding of the landowners.
Whoever can would hoard, and so it's a disaster. But my take on this is that the idea that a central government with roads and an army and a tax system should have fixed that is a bit of an exaggeration, because that kind of government didn't exist. The Qajars did not have a centralized army even. They did not have a centralized system of tax collection. These are the things that the constitutional movement and the revolution, if it had time, would have. These were projects to be implemented. I think the confusion is there's an expectation as if we had those things, and then came the 10 years of chaos and we lost them, and then comes Reza Khan and we restore them. Whereas, no, Iran didn't have any of those things. Iran did not have the infrastructure of either nationhood or a modern statehood. All of those were blueprints, agenda to be built. And the Democrats had a program for that. They say, okay, let's do it. Let's have constitutions that means a parliamentary system. It means everybody gets the right to vote. It means freedom of expression. It means these journals flourish. And we debate and discuss how to go about, should we have a unified army? They were for that. They even talked about the question of, is Iran one nation in the modern sense, or is it several nations? For example, the most outstanding case of kind of bilingual, they could never clarify this issue, but there was a discussion of perhaps Iran could be a modern nation but bilingual, because about 30% of the population, their first language was Turkish, Azeri Turkish. And in Azerbaijan, there in 1920, there's this government led by Khiyabani, again a Democrat. So again, here we go back to affiliation with social democracy, and a constitutionalist. And he was not a secessionist, he was not a separatist, because, as people have noted, he deliberately changed the name of his autonomous government. He had set up an autonomous government, and the idea of Khiyabani, the idea of Mirza Kuchek Khan, the idea of Colonel Pesyan was not to separate Azerbaijan or Gilan or Khorasan from Iran and make it an independent country. Their idea was to make those provinces centers for a march on Tehran and restoring the Tehran government on a more democratic constitutionalist basis, as had happened in the years 1909, 1910. That was the model. These movements are usually condemned as separatist. None of them were separatist. And all of them were more democratic, definitely more constitutionalist than the government that was placed in Tehran in 1921. Now, I have to backtrack as to how we got in there. I'm not denying that there was tremendous damage and chaos, but that wasn't because constitutional government wasn't working. It was because the country is occupied and there are 3 foreign armies fighting each other and, creating havoc in Iran. Going back to now, there's one more thing we have to remember. In that period of occupation, the origin of the Gilan rebellion goes back to that time. We have a man by the name of Kuchek Khan. Kuchek Khan is a constitutionalist. He had taken part in the civil war to defend the constitution. During the occupation of Iran, he forms a militia in the forested areas of Gilan and the Jangals, and so this is called the Jangal movement. And he gravitates for support to the Ottomans. Why? Because who are Iran enemies? It's the Russians. In the north, he's fighting the Russians. The British are in the south at the time he forms this. He's in Gilan, he's in the north. His base is there, and he's fighting Tsarist Russian occupation forces. Where can he get support? He gets support from the Ottoman German side. People also don't remember this, that Iran's constitutionalist government was very pro-German, pro-Ottoman during World War I. Again, why? Because the Russians, and by this time most of them think that the British are also our enemy. Who could be our friend? Well, Germany. And here you can see that a group of Iranian constitutionalists, again led by Democrats, led by Hassan Taqiyzadeh, they gathered in Berlin and they published the leading kind of periodical of that time, that is Nationalist Kaveh. And in it, they are socialist, they're pro-German, and they are very nationalistic. So this gravitation towards a third power who could be our support vis-a-vis the British and the Russians begins during the war. And so
is it true that the support was really for Germany, and kind of the side support for the Ottomans was because they were allies of Germany, It wasn't necessarily between direct connection between the government at the time and the Ottomans, but because the Ottomans were in support of Germany, was that
Yes,
more
no,
of
that,
that?
that, that is correct. There was a lot of and they were not wrong because had the U.S. not joined World War One, Germany had won it. So to invest in the German side of this war as opposed to the Russo-British side was kind of logistically correct thinking. But things changed because Tsarism collapsed, and Tsarism collapsed. Northern Iran is freed, but not the south because the British are still in the south, and they push and they come all the way to Tehran, and they even form a force to march all the way to Baku. And so it's the British who are now the decisive foreign occupation force in Iran. The Dunster force is in northern Iran. And so Iranian nationalists now, again, are in a very confused situation. The Russian Revolution changes everything. And
Take us to Kuchai Khan. You were taking us to there. What happened that fell apart?
Kuchai Khan is already, during the war, he is getting help from the Ottoman German side. And he has a famous or infamous, depending on our point of view, German advisor who stays there to the very end with him. So this is important because his reliance on the Bolsheviks is not the first time he relies on foreign forces. And one cannot say what understanding he had of Bolshevism. So during the war, Kuchai Khan was a pan-Islamist. Pan-Islamism was a movement that basically the Ottomans had initiated. They wanted to unite all Muslims under the Ottoman Sultan to fight on the German side of this war. By that time, that was the meaning of that movement. And Kuchai Khan was part of it. Kaveh and Iranian Democrats also, they're more really secularists, but they were allies of that movement. And so during the war, Kuchai Khan he's a fierce nationalist. There's no question about that. And he probably was a sincere, devout Muslim. But politically, it was pan-Islamist because that was where the alliance was. Then he loses it. When the German Ottoman side loses the war, then who does he have to support him now? The adversary are the British who are in occupation of Tehran. And they're pushing into the Gilan territory. Here is where the Baku Bolsheviks, who the British are going to overthrow, they reach out to Kuchai Khan and say, well, you want some support? You're fighting the British? We're fighting the British. At that time, the Bolsheviks are fighting the Russian Civil War, and the British are fighting on the side of the Russian counter-revolutionaries, the whites. So, enemy of my enemy is my friend. And what choice does Kuchai Khan have? He accepts their support. And what Bolshevism meant to him is not very clear, and exactly what the Bolsheviks were going to do wasn't even clear to them. They were not sure exactly how far they wanted to go. What they needed to do is they taken over in 1917, and once they took over, they did something that was very important to Iran. They made peace with Germany, and in that peace treaty, right after they came to power, early 1918, in Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, that treaty recognized Iran's independence and national sovereignty when Iran is occupied by the British. So that was important. More important than that was Lenin declared that all of the Tsarist concessions in Iran were annulled. The new Bolshevik government was not going to follow that imperialist policy. Now, some Iranian nationalists expected him to go and give back all of the Caucasus provinces that the Tsars had occupied.
Turkmenistan and Golestan. Yes.
He wasn't going to go that far. Plus, the Bolsheviks didn't control those provinces. At that time, it was up in the air for grabs. So he couldn't. I'm not talking about his intentions, But he did what he could, which was Tsar's concessions are gone. We don't, and this was tremendously welcomed in Iran. We have the famous, saying by Bahar, Malik al-Shu'ara, who has said, two men have ropes around Iran's head and they're pulling from both sides, strangling this man. Iran is suffocating. One of them lets go of his side, and so Iran can breathe and stay alive. And the man who let go of his side of the rope is Lenin. And Arif, Malik al-Shu'ara himself, they praise, Lenin's, greatness. They don't really know what Lenin is doing, but we have to remember that Lenin himself was not exactly sure what he was going to do. And here, I guess, we can come to the landing of the Red Army in Iran in early 1920, May 1920. There's a fairly small Red Army naval detachment in pursuit of the White Russian forces that have landed in Gilan. And in Gilan, the British have given them protection. There are 2,000 British troops who have given refuge to a detachment of White Russian army. And the Reds pursue them. They attack Anzali. They bombard it. They drive out the British and they take back the White Navy. And they run into Kuchek Khan, who is basically defeated and forced into the forest by the British. He comes out. The British are gone. The Red Army is there. And here's where I think historians also usually make the mistake. They think that the Soviets had this design on Iran and they used Kuchek Khan as their pawn. It wasn't like that. He goes and proposes to them an alliance. And very quickly, they're willing. And you have to understand that these decisions are made on the spot. They're not kind of... Moscow is still in the middle of the civil war. And what happens in Iran is really the last thing on their mind. They have bigger fish to fry. They don't mind, of course, kind of extending the revolution as far as it goes. And so it's Kuchak Khan who goes and meets the commander of the Red Army and proposes an alliance, and they're willing, of course. And so they declared the Soviet Socialist Republic of Iran, not of Gilan. So the idea is we're going to form a republic and we're going to march on Tehran and we're going to liberate Tehran with Soviet support. And this gets very complicated. This is the beginning of, I've used this expression that I borrowed from a book that Khosrow Shakiri wrote. He's called it the birth of the trauma. And by that, he means this painful relationship of the Iranian left with Soviet Marxism and Soviet communism. And it begins, in a sense, right then and there in the Republic of Gilan or Iran, calling it the Republic of Socialists. They call it socialist. What does it mean exactly? Now, we know that Kuchek Khan made terms with the Soviets. And his terms were this, and this is ironical, but Soviet policy was agreeable to this. Kuchek Khan's terms were no anti-Islamic propaganda. He was the head of that republic, and it's called the Socialist Republic. It says it respects Islam, and it's not going to carry out any communist or radical social reform measures until we have liberated Tehran. Then we decide what we want to do. So you can see that it looks like, from his perspective, it's a tactical alliance to get support and complete what was his agenda, which was a nationalist agenda. He could not fight the British. The British had defeated him. But now with Soviet support, he could. It was possible to take Tehran. So he agrees to that Soviet Republic. But again, you can see that he was mistaken because it doesn't last. It was, there the picture gets very complicated.
And he had the same issues within, what type of government did he want? Did he want complete land reform for the peasants, or was he supporting the landowners? There was this ambiguity between him and the Communist Party, which was, interestingly, everything comes to a head around 1919 when the Communist Party is formed, and you see the distinction between the Jangali movement and the Communist Party. That's that internal strife, which started at the constitutional period, continues yet again.
Exactly as you said, the Soviet Republic of Gilan is emblematic of all of these problems at the same time, because right at that time, 1919 going into 1920, the Iranian Communist Party is formed, and like most communist parties everywhere, it's, if you want to call them the left wing of the Social Democrats, they gravitate towards communism. And why shouldn't they? Because in Russia, the first attempt to build socialism is being made. Nobody knows if it's going to be successful or not. It's very tenuous. They're hanging by their teeth. The whole world is united against them. Somehow they win that civil war. And again, it's that year 1920 that the fate of the Soviet Union itself is hanging in the balance. And so Iranian Communist Party is formed again in Baku. Everything kind of connects there. And when people talk about Soviet intervention in Iran, the picture is very complicated, because Baku communist Bolsheviks pretty much decide on their own. They don't necessarily coordinate with Moscow. Moscow is far away, and I'm not saying this to kind of defend them, because I think in the end, their policy towards Iran was abusive, to say the least. If you don't call it a betrayal, they used and abused Iranian revolutionaries.
Whereas 1990, earlier with Lenin, and he was the hero of the Bolshevik Revolution and giving back these lands. A few years later, the disenchantment between the Iranian far left and the Soviets, communism begins.
Khrushchev Khan refuses to believe this, because when these Iranian communists come to Anzali and say yes, this is a socialist republic. Who are you? We're communists. We just formed the Communist Party, and we're your allies. And we want to carry out land reform, and we want to march on Tehran right now. And they do. And Khrushchev Khan tells them, no, wait a minute. This is going too fast, too far. Don't do it. And they want to do it, so he withdraws from that government. So his participation in the Soviet Republic collapses after about a month. So he takes his forces and goes back to the Jangal. The communists, led by this hot-headed Ehsanullah Khan, who was part of the terror committee of the Constitutional Revolution, says, okay, I'm going to march on Tehran. And the march on Tehran is a disaster. So the British, of course, are there. They can overpower the Jangali forces and have airplanes. They're no match for, if the British were not in Tehran, yes, they would have taken it. And even in the British, there's this panic that a Bolshevik march on Tehran is imminent in the fall of 1920. But things have fallen apart, because in the Jangal, you have at least 4 sets of players kind of working at cross purposes. You have Khrushchev Khan, who's a nationalist. He's accepted to get support from the Bolsheviks, but he quickly realizes that the Baku Bolsheviks and the Iranian Communist Party are doing one thing, and this is not necessarily with Lenin's approval. So he appeals to Lenin. Tell him, hey, these guys, these communists in Iran are making a mess of it. Please correct their line. And it takes a while. Lenin is having other problems, and the big issue is a shift of Soviet or Bolshevik strategy. By the end of 1920, they made their peace with the British Empire. The Soviet military confrontation comes to an end. The Soviets have won the Russian Civil War. So they want peace and stability. They're not going to push for world revolution. They're going to go into a different course.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I want you to pause here. Explain to us the importance of that. We talk about this, okay, they want to make peace with the British, but that has profound ramifications for Iran, for the Persian movement, for the Jangali movement, for Khorasan. And it also leads us into the coup of 1921. People think that happened in a vacuum. It was with direct support of the British, Colonel Smythe, the General Ironside, the Reza Khan coming from Qazvin, which was a British fort there, the non-objection or the looking the other way of Russia. Explain to us how this agreement, and where you're talking about the disenchantment with communism, how Russia kind of turned its back to the communist leftist movements in search of the bigger picture, which was Reza Khan and Zia.
Yes, this is again.
We missed that point, that it was an agreement of the Russians and the British for this to occur, and tell us why the reasons for both sides, for the British after the war and the Russians at that time, why they came to this agreement. And they both forwent some of their rights and their advantages to come to this bigger conclusion over Iran.
The British Empire is exhausted and basically bankrupt. It cannot go on having its armies extended all over Asia and Europe. It has to pull back. And so they decide to scale down, and they know that they have to evacuate Iran. Now, they're not going to let go of southern Iran where the oil interests are. But they begin to negotiate with the Russians over like a mutual evacuation of forces from Iran. And you have to remember that the British occupation is much more important because they have occupied the country all the way to the capital. The Soviets are in that kind of a small corner in the north. So they reach an agreement to end their mutual military occupation of Iran, the Soviet being smaller, the British being much more important. And at the same time, the government in Tehran is negotiating with Moscow to sign a treaty of peace and friendship to make the giving up of the Soviet concessions official and to respect each other.
Who was negotiating that on behalf of the Iranians?
It begins before the coup. It begins in 1920. And it's a long series of negotiations. I forgot the Iranian envoy they sent to negotiate with Moscow. I think Moshiruddoleh, but I'm not sure.
Zia does part of that, right?
Zia is in Tehran. Zia is a journalist widely known as pro-British. He's in Tehran. But the Qajar government in Tehran sends a representative to Moscow to negotiate this peace and friendship treaty. And it's made official and finalized by early 1921. And coincidentally, that treaty is signed a week after Zia and Reza Khan carry out their coup. So they take the credit for it, but it's not made by them. It was in the works, and they're lucky to have come in while. But this is very important because the government of Said Zia, Reza Khan is the military arm of that. His role was very important because it was a military coup, and the Cossacks, even though their numbers are small, they're the ones who take over. And it's important because Iran also had at least one other more modern, relatively more progressive constitutionalist military force, and that was the gendarmerie. So the Cossack move also means that Tehran is in the hands of the most reactionary part of the Iranian military. The Cossacks were anti-constitutionalists. They're the ones who were fighting Mirza Khoshay Khan in the Jangal also, not the gendarmes. The gendarmes have, at this time, a pro-Said Zia ally in Khorasan, and that is Colonel Pesyan, who's a nationalistic gendarme officer who's been fighting the British and the Russians during the war. He spent time in Germany. Um, he's a constitutionalist, so his credentials as an Iranian constitutionalist officer is far superior to Reza Khan. Reza Khan, if anything, is associated with reaction, with Cossacks, with Russian officers. But when the British are evacuating, they decide that he fits the best kind of a picture for the man they want to watch their back in Tehran. Uh, Now, this idea of someone is a puppet is people think of a puppet simplistic way, like someone from London calls you every day and tells you what to do. First of all, London knew nothing about what was going on the ground in Iran. It's the British military commanders, the high command like Ironside, others. They decide what to do. And they decided that, yeah, it's better to have some kind of an order in Tehran. We're leaving. The Soviets are leaving. We're going to have the ironic situation is we're leaving, the Soviets are leaving. But we won because we keep our most precious concession, which is the oil in the south in Iran, in our hands, whereas the Soviets have lost everything. They gave up all of their concessions. We didn't. So it's not a question. They're not leaving Iran on an equal footing. And they've put in place a government in Iran. Everybody knew that Said Zia is a British ally. Reza Khan was a wild card. Nobody knew what he was about. And I think he also was a very shrewd man. He kind of figured it out on his feet. It wasn't like he came in with a clear agenda. We have reports that he was hesitant when they told him that, when you want to march on Tehran, he took it. He saw the chance. But already an agreement between the great powers has been reached that Iran is going to be independent. We evacuate the country, and we're going to have order in the capital. And who is going to be in charge of this order? This new government that is led by Said Zia and backed by the Cossack forces of Reza Khan. And so the Soviets, they pull out from their commitment to or support of Mirza Kuchek Khan. The Soviet minister in Tehran offers Soviet troops to go and put down Pesyan's movement in Khorasan. It goes that far in not only, supporting the Tehran government against these contenders, but says, we don't support them. If you want, we help you crush them.
Yet another source of disenchantment between Iranian left and communism and the far left and Soviet communism at this point. They turned their back on Gilan, they turned their back on Khorasan.
Yes, in the 1970s, there's a theorist of the Iranian guerrilla movement of Fadaiyan by the name, he was affiliated with them. He never became really a part of them, by the name of Mustafa Shoaiyan. And he wrote a book on the Jangal movement. And in it, he criticized Lenin to the point that he says Lenin betrayed not only Iran, but world revolution. Now, I think the fact of it is more complicated than that. But what remains is, yes, they abandoned the Jangal movement. But the question of the Jangal's failure is, do we want to, I guess it's...
They weren't very supportive of the kind of communism that Lenin wanted either. They just kind of, their lots were in the same place. But
They tried. What happened is, I think Lenin wanted a change of course. He realized that the radical communist push was not going to work. So the leadership of the Iranian Communist Party was changed. The hotheads were restrained, and they put at its head Haydar Khan, who was someone more experienced. He was involved in the Constitutional Revolution. And so the idea was to somehow reconcile with Kuchek Khan. And they did, because Kuchek Khan came back and in 1921, once again, formed a government. He joined the government, this time with Haydar Khan at the head of the Communist Party. But that didn't last either. It turned into a fiasco. They started shooting each other. Haydar Khan was killed, apparently by Mirza's forces. So the communists and nationalists in Iran fell apart. Um, who was supporting who is not clear, because Moscow's line, Lenin's line was, we are not going to interfere in Iran. We're leaving. And they left. Baku Bolsheviks seem to have been more aggressively still involved. The Communist Party was supposed to have reconciled by Kuchak Khan, but they started fighting each other. So usually a lot of people are very quick at assigning blames, as the Kuchak Khan was, he was anti-communist, so he killed Haydar Khan. Moscow betrayed Iran. I think, I'm not trying to defend any side, but I think this picture is very complicated and kind of simplistic. It inevitably, the Soviets had to put their own interest first. I'm not defending it, but I can see the picture is that, fine, we're done. We're in power in the former Tsarist empire. Who cares about Iran? We pull out our forces. There's this guy in Tehran. By that time, it was clear it's Reza Khan. Said Zia, in fact, Reza Khan kind of helped get rid of Said Zia. He became the strong man in Tehran. And
that's where I want to go. This explanation kind of goes in line with the title of your work, The Different Shades of Red, because you realize it's not such a uniform ideology, the left, and you see these issues. Let's go forward. Let's start from 1921 to 25. Ziauddin comes with Reza Khan. They come with a couple thousand soldiers. The coup happens. They take over. He becomes prime minister. Reza Khan becomes minister of war. At that time, the political left thinks these are their darlings because they start arresting some of the Qajars. They start the prominent landowners, and they feel this is a change. Where does this stop? Where does this go too far? And this trend of liberalism and the social democratic agenda, it comes to a halt. And that's with the arrest of Zia. Explain to us how that went and how he went a little too far with what was expected and what the status quo was.
Yeah, I think those years between 1921 and 1920, by the end of 1925, Reza Khan is Reza Shah, and an entirely different period of Iranian history begins with the Pahlavi dynasty. But those 5 years, 1921 to 1925, I think are extremely crucial, and for the understanding of everything that happened, including the story of the Iranian left. As you said, and many people have noticed this, by that time, then who is the left is kind of a confused issue, because some of the left are the leftovers of the social democrats, or people who call themselves Democrats. Some of them go and form a party that calls itself socialist. And that party, more or less, is supportive of Reza Khan. And then increasingly, not less, completely supportive of Reza Khan. The Iranian Communist Party seems to be confused between one faction that says, well, Reza Khan is a bourgeois nationalist and we have to support him. And another faction that says, no, this is a dictator. And that, by the way, is Iran's, one of the leading newspapers of Tehran is called Haqiqat. And it's the organ of the communist faction that I think is more committed to constitutionalism and yet is very pro-Soviet and very much anti-Reza Khan. And as a consequence, is shut down by the end of that year. But Haqiqat represents this communist trend that sees Reza Khan for what he is and increasingly going to become, with support of a very strong and increasingly dominant trend in Iranian nationalism. And here's their argument is Iran is or is coming out of a period of chaos and disintegration, and look at us. The Jangalis are still there. Colonel Pesyan is autonomous in Khorasan. And what we need is a savior. We need a man on a white horse to put an end to this chaos. Forget about constitutionalism as a good idea, but it didn't work anyway. And at any rate, first we need order. First we need a centralized government. First we need a unified army. Then we can talk about all of those issues. This line increasingly becomes, and it's of course it's very convenient to Reza Khan because he says, "I'm your man," and the left in this middle is confused because Moscow is also confused. There's a tendency there who says, this guy, all right, he's there. We came to some kind of agreement with him. There's another line that says, no, he's going to be the enemy of us. And that confusion, Reza Khan, of course, is very good at playing everybody against each other. But I think looking back, the argument that Iran was on the verge of disintegration and chaos is not true. If anything, the 10 years of, the epidemic, foreign occupation, Iran had bad roads and it was unsafe. It was unsafe and it had bad roads before that. That has nothing, that was not a new thing. The question was, all right, now we're at a point where we can put things together and continue or restart the project of nation building and state formation. Do we want to do it at the minimum of taking constitutionalism seriously? Because we had political parties. We had freedom of the press in 1921. Small, because, what's Tehran's population? 300,000 people, maybe 10% of them could read and write. But we had a minimum of constitutional freedoms and a functioning constitutional government. So the question is, should we try to maintain this and gradually maybe expand this? And we have to remember that the socialists are supportive of this, and at least some of the communists are supportive of this. Or do we need to first have a hyper-centralized kind of a military dictatorship and then decide where we want to go with it? So the contention was between these two trends. One of them, a trend that was open, it was advocated by some of Reza Shah's future architects of his state, including Davar, for example, who was their most educated one. He had degrees from Europe, and his idea was, his famous arguments is, forget about education, forget about culture, first build railroads. He had this very positivistic idea of authoritarian modernity forced from above. Once you have accomplished that, everything else followed. What followed is he himself had to commit suicide. He's the architect of Iran's modern, secular legal system.
One of the things that we see this trend is the same reforms and same ideologies that arose in the constitutional movement and stopped the 1919 post-treaty by the British and defended Iran against all these incursions continued with Reza Khan into becoming Reza Shah. You talk about the support of the left, the Social Democrats for Reza Shah and Reza Khan, and that came to a head with the proposal of a republic. I want you to take us through that. But something I want you to address is, this is something that most Iranians don't understand, is Reza Khan came to power, became king because of the clergy. Big support of the clergy as opposed to republicanism. And in 1953, the Shah came to power because of the support of the clergy and Kashani. Take us back to 1925. This proposal of the Republican scared a lot of people in Iran, a lot of traditionalists, a lot of conservatives. It's comparison to what happened in Turkey with Ataturk. Explain to us this break of the left with sticking to their guns and wanting a republic and the reforms they thought, and the creation of Reza Shah, which meant the end to constitutionalism and all those ideals that the Social Democrats held so dear.
Well, the idea of a republic was tried in Iran in Gilan. So they actually had tried to, and they had set up a republic which failed. In that sense, I said republicanism was an idea associated with the left. But people who in 1924 advocated for republic in Iran were not leftist. The socialists supported that. But these were people who really wanted Reza Khan to be Iran's dictator. And their model was Ataturk. It was not yet called Ataturk, but it was Mustafa Kemal and the Turkish Republic. So part of the left was behind that. Another part of people who were Democrats like Bahar, Malik al-Shara, future Malik al-Shara, people like Ishqi, it was not exactly, it's hard to pin him down. He was maybe more of an anarchist. But these people were said, Reza Khan's republicanism is bogus. It's like it doesn't make any difference to him whether he's called Shah or president. If he's president, he's going to be president for life. So this is to make his dictatorship official in the guise of republicanism. Who was opposed to that was not just the clergy. Of course, partisans of the Qajar were opposed to that because that meant a republic meant the end of a Qajar dynasty, which came the next year as Reza Khan became Reza Shah. But I am not saying that Reza Khan did not become Shah because the clergy made him Shah. They were part of the opposition to idea of republic. And once he went and he saw their leaders in Rome and he told them, okay, you don't like a republic, I don't like a republic. I'm a good Muslim. And they were okay with him. I think what they agreed to was that he was effectively Iran's dictator. And there were people who, even before 1924, argued that the model for Iran is fascist Italy. We want a man who is like Mussolini. Others wouldn't label it that way, but it was clear that there has to be someone who is in charge. And this man is Reza Khan, who is by then was prime minister and war minister. And the backing came from the armed forces where the Cossacks now prevailed, having destroyed the gendarme rivals in Khorasan. So the Republican campaign, I didn't mean to say it was a leftist campaign. What I meant was the idea of a republic was first put forward and experimented with in Gilan. So it had that association. But the model of Reza Khan's supporters was Turkey. And the opposition came from the clergy, but not only from the clergy. It also came from a lot of people, constitutionalists, Democrats, nationalists, who realized this is a ploy, this is a game. The game plan is to make Reza Khan, really who is effectively Iran's dictator, make that position official, whether as president or king. So the idea was, if you don't want me as president, fine. Let's remove the Qajars and I'll become the king of a new dynasty.
Do you think this is something he planned, or just things happened and just steamrolled into this?
He very cleverly guided this because as early as 1921, he met with an association, not a political party, they called itself the Young Iran Party. And they had a program. And the program was what I call a kind of stepping back from commitment to real constitution. It was a stepping back from constitutionalism as somehow meaningful social representation. It didn't need to be perfect, but the socially representative component taken seriously. By 1921, a part of the old constitutionalist movement had given up on that. So it's not, they thought that constitutionalism had failed, but really what had happened, constitutionalism had not failed. They had given up on it. Their idea was, and this program said, well, let's have a secular government, let's have a centralized legal system, let's have a unified army, let's have public education, but it didn't say let's also have some agrarian reform. It didn't say let's try to have like a robust parliamentary system. Those were kind of now on the sideline. Reza Khan met with them, and interestingly, the story, which is it appears in many sources, he said, I want to know that you, Javanan Urupa Dide, European educated youth of this country, what is your program? And apparently he met with them, with Dr. Siyasi, who was their head. He read their program and said, this is a good program, but I implement it.
Let me ask you a question realistically from someone that understands the left very, very thoroughly. And you got to give credit to what Reza Shah did, the reforms that he did. Now, I know there was a lot of people involved, but it was really incredible where it brought Iran. Now, do you think Sans Reza Shah, with a social democratic government, with constitutionalism, would we have been able to have a unified army like he did? Would we have been able to establish the railroads that we did? Would we have been able to overhaul the judicial system, overhaul the educational system, put a curb to some of the Islamic control of the judiciary, some of the freedoms that were granted to women, minor as they were, that was granted? Do you think within the period of 1925 to 1942, that period that we had before World War II, had there been no Reza Shah, had there been a constitutional government there with the infighting and the bickering that exists in the Iranian political spectrum, would those things have been possible without having a strong dictator?
Well, I can't do counterfactual history. I can't argue that, all these things and even more or better would have happened had we held on to the kind of a weak fledgling constitutionalism we had. But I think if I had lived at that time, I've been opposed to Reza Khan as a dictator. And why does kind of building of roads and education require a dictatorship? That is what I can't see.
Well, and some of the people may go back and look at the previous 10 years from 1911 to 1921, the devastation that occurred. Now, I agree with you. I don't believe that was the fault of social democracy or constitutionalism, but the revolution, the constitutional revolution, the demise of the power of the Shah and centralist control, the coming up of constitutional democracy, even though it was overthrown, it had no power. But some people associated that with the lack of centralized control and chaos and bickering, and it was things that Iranian people didn't understand, and it couldn't bring the country together in a nationalist way. Again, I'm not putting you in the spot and say, well, would have been different, but you see the limitations that posed, and was this just the most expedient, fastest way forward, and would another way succeed? And again, I want to bring this question back to today some point, where we still see the same thing after 1978. And again, let's take a step back from what we're talking about. In the early constitutional period, you have freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of parties. 1921 to 25, you had the same thing. Somewhat freedom of speech, as you just mentioned. Again, 1942 to 1953, you somehow have different parties, different political beliefs. You have the same thing again in 1978 for a short period. And I just want to look at these patterns and learn. And I see the pattern that exists is you have everybody's euphoric. We have freedom. There was a vacuum. There was a fall of a dictator power. What comes next? Well, sure, you have periodicals, you have speech, you have political parties. It's amazing. But then it turns in a little nasty. You start having, slandering each other. You start having assassinations. You start having a little bit of anarchy, disorder. And in the end, Iranians always gravitate towards a strong man coming to save us. That's been the pattern. And again, I'm not putting you in the spot. I just want us to know. And I hope that there is a chance for us to do it without a strong man. But realistically, how feasible is that, as opposed to bringing in here and bringing multiple ideas and constitutionalism and parties? You see what I'm saying? How practical? I mean, I'm idealistic just like you, but how does it happen in real life on the ground?
Yeah, no, that's a very tough and relevant question. To tackle that question, we have to think, let's go back to those years 21, 25. I think what happened there was the rise of Reza Khan and his turning into Reza Shah a dynast and then increasingly a dictator. He was not as dictatorial in the beginning. As he became, his dictatorship degenerated into a murderous rampage in the 1930s, and he destroyed practically everyone who had supported him on the climb up. So the question to ask is, was that something that was necessary? There is a historical narrative that says, yes, that's unfortunate, but to build roads and to have a railroad and to have like rudimentary education, that was the only way to go. I disagree with that. I think that was a project that won over possible other ways of moving forward, and it became victorious by force and eliminated, like, journalists were murdered, Eshki was murdered, Bahar was an attempted murder on his life, and they killed someone who looked like him. And the Majlis that kind of disqualified or removed Qajars and then made Reza Khan Shah, it was packed, it was under military threat, martial law. So already you had some kind of the foundations of a dictatorial regime in place. There's a narrative that says that was necessary. I'm questioning that. I'm saying that wasn't necessary. This was one option that won over another option, which would have been, we had a weak but functioning constitutional government under the Qajars. And a different way of looking at this is the possibility to eliminate Reza Khan from the scene. And there was an attempt to eliminate him. At some point, he got into a conflict with the Majlis. He made a qahr. He said, I'm leaving. They went, including Dr. Mossadegh, and they brought him back.
A tactic his son would use later, too.
Yes, so it's not what has happened, and we can't change it. But I think it's a mistake to think that this is the way it happened, so therefore it was necessary for that. People who want to defend Reza Shah's record argue that this was all necessary because the alternative would have, they are kind of holding this up against a possible alternative that would have been chaos or much worse. I'm saying no, the alternative would not necessarily have been worse, except that the alternative lost. Why did the alternative lose? Because of force and violence. Why was Mossadegh eliminated? Because of a military coup, foreign involvement. Why did the Islamic Republic prevailed? Because by force and violence, it eliminated every other contender. And it has lasted 45 years. So does that mean that all of this was necessary? I would say no, it wasn't necessary. It was a political option that prevailed, and by force. That doesn't make it necessary.
We talked about the fragmentation of the left during the time of Reza Shah, with some deciding to support the regime while some deciding to a more radical approach against it. Talk about the challenges that were faced by the left under this harsh regime, which allowed very little freedom of the press, freedom of political thought. What was the left going through during this period?
Well, Reza Shah's regime was not unusual. If you look at even European regimes in the period between the two world wars, you either have like fascist dictatorships, or you have more or less kind of regimes that are leaning to the right. And it's not as if the rest of the world or even Europe was this kind of a flourishing democracy, and Iran was the only country where we had a dictatorial regime. So I don't want to, single out Iran under Reza Shah as an exceptionally kind of, exceptional political. I think in many ways it conformed to the kind of regimes that were being fought at that time. Also, nation state formation and the formation of modern states invariably involves repression. It's usually kind of authoritarian. It requires a centralized state. almost no nation is formed by someone coming and asking everyone, how do you want to form a state and who wants to be citizens? It's usually authoritarian and centralized. So the same thing that happened in Iran. There was this argument that we have to have one national language. It has to be Persian, and education has to be in Persian, and we need uniformity. We need a centralized armed forces. Uh, Reza Shah, I can find a quote for you. At some point, when during the Kashf Hijab, a lot of people were kind of praising Kashf Hijab as like a major accomplishment, and interestingly, he didn't like it. Reza Shah even didn't like. I've written something I can share with
Kashf
you.
hijab is the banning of the veil.
Banning of the
Yes.
veil. At first, he didn't like he had more than one wife, and he didn't want them to appear in public. And plus, unveiling at that time didn't necessarily mean you even bare your head. It meant dressing European. So you could have a hat on your head. And if you look at the pictures of the unveiling under Reza Shah, the major event, they're dressed like women are dressed under the Islamic Republic. Nobody's showing their hair. So that event is usually kind of celebrated as a major breakthrough. It wasn't. It was kind of an attempt to make the appearance of at least elite women more conform to kind of European standards. But Reza Shah is on record saying my most important accomplishment was a قشون متحد الشکل, a unified armed forces. So he saw his mission as something like that. Now there are advances in education. They built roads, and the Tehran University was formed. They built the railroad, and I'm not saying these things are setbacks.
One thing, I'm sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. You mentioned the military. For me, it's very interesting that cornerstone of Reza Shah's reign was his military. It was his darling. He spent his attention on it. He was a military man himself, and his son as well. He spent a large portion of Iran's GDP, even borrowing at the end, to support the military. Yet both of those forces were ineffective to protecting his rule.
That's a good
They're
question.
both of their rules.
And that that takes us back to what was the function of the Iranian armed forces under Reza Shah. They never fought a foreign enemy. He only deployed them to pacify different parts of Iran and rule as a military dictator. Reza Shah's rule was basically a military dictatorship that became more and more kind of a psychotic aspect of his personality, murderous. He killed pretty much everyone who had helped him rise up to that position. There are no checks on him. He was avaricious. He kind of confiscated or bullied his way into confiscating people's property. He became Iran's largest landowner. To focus on his aspects of his political rule that affected the left, pretty much the remnants of the left, including the small socialist party or the communists, they were swept aside with everybody else. The dictatorship wasn't just aimed against the left. It didn't allow any kind of real representation. But in the early 1930s, they deliberately targeted the left, and they passed a piece of legislation that was called it was basically an anti-communist piece of legislation. It made membership in any organization that advocated collectivism. They called it anti-collectivist laws. Not to make it kind of sound anti-communist, they call it anti-collectivist. Membership in collectivist organization was a crime punishable by 3 to 10 years imprisonment. And that's a horrible, just membership. You don't have to do anything. If you were a member of a communist group or a socialist group, it was punishable by that. And then the remnants of whoever was communist, like Jafar Pishavari, others, people, members of the Iranian Communist Party. By this time, those who were in Iran were put in prison. And ironically, those who fled to the Soviet Union, the leaders were all purged in the Stalinist purges. So during the Stalinist purges in the 1930s, Stalin murdered the leadership of Iranian communists, those who had refugees in the Soviet Union, or sent them to labor camps. And Reza Shah put the rest of them in prison. So
talk about that. There's very little is known, but there was large numbers, thousands of Iranians that went to Siberia and the gulags, and they suffered there. We know very little about that history.
We know very little about this history because the Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh party, didn't want to talk about that. But exactly how many is not known, but some of the most famous ones, for example, Haydar Khan died in the Jangal final conflicts. Sultanzadeh, who was the biggest theorist of the Communist Party, he was a pretty accomplished man theoretically. He was close to Lenin. He wrote several books afterwards in the Soviet Union, and he was the left wing of the Iranian Communist Party. He died in Stalinist purges. And there were others. Another one was Mortaza Alavi, who was a student leader in Germany. The remnants of Iranians from the time of Taqizadeh and after that in Berlin, including Taqi Arani, who started out as an ardent Iranian nationalist, very kind of hot-headed, and he says this too. He started as almost like a right-wing nationalist, but he gravitated to the left, and their leader, there was a small communist circle, mostly active among the Iranian students in Europe at that time. Their numbers were small, into the hundreds. But Berlin was one of their centers, and a communist cell led by Mortaza Alavi, the brother of Bozorg Alavi. Bozorg was there too, but he was secondary to his brother. Mortaza was the leader of that communist circle, and they had anti-Reza Shah propaganda. They organized this group they called it Republican, Nationalist Republicans. And Mortaza Alavi finally died in Stalinist purges too. So their numbers are significant, but nobody knows the exact figures.
Why did these Stalinist purges occur around the same time as Reza Shah's purges of the left in Iran? How did they intersect?
The timing was coincidental, but I mean, this was late 1930s, was the peak of both regimes' kind of murderous, pathological tendencies. I mean, it's not exactly clear what the function of Stalinist purges were, because Stalin was firmly in the saddle. Why was it necessary to pretty much 90% of all of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution, those who had stayed alive, were wiped out during Stalinist purges? Now, he didn't need to go that far. I mean, they were effectively out of power. But, and we have to admit that Reza Khan's purges were not that harsh. He put the communists in prison. Now, Taqi Arani, who may be someone we should talk to, because Taqi Arani and his circle, the Donia circle, is the most important kind of a communist or left activity under Reza Shah in the 1930s. Evidence suggests that he was basically murdered in prison. He was exposed to typhus and a harsh treatment. They didn't shoot him, but they put him in conditions in prison which caused his death. The others remained in prison, and they were the famous Group of 53, were released when Reza Shah fell, and they joined the formation of the Tudeh party. So maybe a bit about Arani's group is in order uh, because he was the center of that circle, but is a very interesting individual. He started out as a nationalist, but while he was getting educated in Berlin, and he was highly educated, he had a PhD in chemistry, so he was a scientist in effect, and he gravitated to the left, and he clearly became a communist. He traveled to Moscow later on, and it was involved with Comintern. Before that, he came to Iran. He returned to Iran, and this is early 1930s. And he began to work for the government because he was a highly educated person. And he decided to publish a journal by the name of Dunya, the world. And he borrowed that name from the French journal Le Monde. Um, his idea seems to have been in this journal. He wanted to advocate, he knew that you couldn't advocate like Marxist ideas. Communism was against the law. So what he could do is he thought he would propagate what he called a scientific worldview. And this is very interesting also because there is an association of the Iranian left and especially communists and Marxists to claim that their worldview is scientific. Arani is someone who was a scientist, and he was trying to present Marxist ideas indirectly. His journal Dunya, on its first issue, has the picture of the atom, and it says science pierces the core of the atom, nuclear physics. And the journal Dunya gradually was kind of talking about different things that Arani himself had worked on. He was quite sophisticated and educated. He had an education that he wrote, for example, about cultural issues. He wrote about Iranian irfan and literature. So he was presenting indirectly Marxist ideas, but the journal didn't last a little more than a year, and it wasn't shut down by the government. It just ceased publication. But in that short period, he seemed to have gathered around himself a number of some European educated Marxists, like Iraj Iskandari, who was in France when Arani was in Berlin, and Bozorg Alavi, and a number of younger university and high school students who became later on prominent in the Tudeh party of Iran, into this Arani circle. They would read, they would discuss things, and it was not a communist organization. It was what Arani had planned for it to be. And then they were arrested. They were arrested, accused of being communist. He did have communist associations, but that circle didn't engage in any kind of communist activities, nor was it an organization. But they were thrown in prison. And what is another, Arani, by the way, is recently getting more attention even by some scholars. Two books on him recently came out. And I think, he deservedly so. He was defended himself in prison, and his defense became very famous, of course, after Reza Shah fell. And he becomes this iconic figure of a public intellectual who's principled, and he speaks truth to power because he defended himself. He was very articulate. He accused the judges of acting at the behest of a dictator. He took a constitutionalist stand. He said, we are defending the tradition of Iranian constitutionalism, and this trial is a travesty of justice. So he defended himself very strongly, and he also argued that this flies in the face of all of your claims of being progressive. And of course, he got the maximum sentence. But that defense he got a lot of attention from people who at the time were the country's intellectuals. And so I think the story of Arani and his circle, even though it was small, especially in retrospect, is a bright kind of example of Iranian Marxists holding on to their principles, and in some ways trying to present leftist ideas, taking advantage of whatever kind of limited opportunities they had. And in those writings, you don't see an out-and-out advocacy of, Iran needs to form a communist party and carry out a socialist revolution. He seems to be much more nuanced. He recognizes that at that time in Iran, the role of the educated elite is very important. He pays a lot of attention to intellectuals. I don't want to exactly compare him to Antonio Gramsci, but they were contemporaries. And Gramsci was someone who also wrote in prison. He pays a lot of attention to intellectuals and to Marxism as cultural struggle for ideas. And so did Arani. And both of them may be under duress because they could not engage in open political activity. So they're going in indirectly. So Arani argues that in Iran, the role of Munawwarul Fikran, Roshan Fikran, or intellectuals is very important. Interestingly, he says most intellectuals conform to the political system and they're conservative. And here he's different from another tradition of the left. Later on with the Tudeh party, there's an argument that an intellectual by definition is a leftist. Which was true at the time of the Tudeh party. Most intellectuals gravitated heavily to the left. But Arani, writing under Reza Shah, said that most intellectuals end up conforming to the political system they live under. But some of them challenge that. And those intellectuals are progressive intellectuals. The others are conservative intellectuals. And he said that we are concerned with the progressive intellectuals. So he seems to have had a different kind of approach to this whole question. He seems to have thought of Marxism as more of a cultural, educational process, where these more progressive intellectuals gradually would educate and lead. He also called them Roshanfikran Rahbar, leading intellectuals. They would lead others into a more kind of progressive path. But again, he never had a chance to put these ideas into practice because, his career and his life came at an end. He wasn't the only victim of Reza Shah.
And it didn't become part of the political discourse, part of the intellectual discourse that people remember. It wasn't widely shared at the time, his ideas.
Well, the Tudeh party, when it was formed after Reza Shah fell...
No, I'm talking about during the period of Reza Shah.
During the period...
We want to see what the role of the left was during that period.
There was no organized left because communism was against the law, and they picked up the remnants of the Communist Party who were in Iran and they put them in prison. So there were communist prisoners in Reza Shah's prisons before Arani's group. His group was added to them and their numbers were not very large. So you can't really speak of communist activities under Reza Shah because then again there was no kind of political activities anyways.
But that kind of suppression created this combustible movement that after the Allied invasion of Iran, it flourished. Before we get into that, Professor, I want to ask you a question, and I think this is one of the most important aspects of our history that no one gives a glance at. It's a question of oil.
Mm-hmm.
The research we've done looking at the history of oil from 1901 to 2024 today. The conclusion we've come to is that the Iranian people, I'm not talking about the governments, the Qajars, the Reza Shah, the Shah, or the Islamic Republic. People of Iran have had very little control or knowledge of this wealth of their country. You start from the Darcy concessions up until 1915. 1915, they did a little revision up until 1935 when Reza Shah revisited that and gave the new concession. 1901 to 1935, we had very little information or audit capability of how much is being produced, how much we get. We just got what the British Petroleum wanted to give us. 1935 to 1942, the accounts of the National Iranian Oil Company and all our proceeds from oil were received in England, in London, under sterling pound until 1939, where Reza Shah changed that and he started receiving money via Canada and Switzerland, and that kind of led to his break with the British government. 1941 to 1953 nationalization is the only period in this 123 years that we actually had audit capability of, the Majlis of the oil. And we were under sanctions because of the nationalization, and we sold very little oil during that period. 1953 to 1978, the accounts for the National Iranian Oil Company were held in Chase in London. The Shah and only a couple of people, not even a handful, less than a handful of people, knew how much money was going into the National Iranian Oil Company account. From there, they would move money into the Bank Markazi, the central bank, and that would be our budget. But we didn't know where that budget was coming from, how much was the original amount. And all those records of the Pahlavi's oil purchases, they disappeared in 1978. We don't have any record of it. The Islamic Republic, they invaded the embassy. Those children carpet weavers wove together secrets of the espionage den and all that. But no oil records, no military purchases, 1953 to 1978. They disappeared. There's a very interesting story of where all that went. I don't want to get into that right now. Then from 1978, 2024 today, we've been under sanctions from the time of taking to the embassy and sanctions. Iran's oil has been sold for cash in the middle of the ocean, transferring from one container to another. How is it that we as intellectuals, again, I don't want to throw this on you, you're one person like me, but how is it as a collective of intellectuals and opposition movements, there's very little talk about that? Now, I understand why the Pahlavis don't want to talk about it, because they controlled the oil, and who knows where that money went. There was an audit at 1941-42 when the UN took, and they realized there was hundreds of millions of dollars at that time taken, and when the Majlis requested it, the British and the Westerners said, forget it, never mind, because they didn't want to return the money. How is it that we're missing this point, Professor? How is it that's the only thing that the foreign forces in Iran, the imperialist forces, the Westerners, the Russians, the Chinese, the Ottomans, that's all they cared about? How is it that we're missing this as a people, and we don't know where our wealth has gone for over a century?
Well, no, that's a big question, and I don't know the technical details that you talked about. But what I can say is that relates to this question of we never had in Iran a sustained period. So what came close to it was people, at least some people, through their representatives, being able to participate in some kind of a national debate as to who's running this country, who's in charge of our resources, where does it go. We never had that. Another aspect of it is it really goes back to that time of the Constitutional Revolution. An interesting question that the Social Democrats of Tabriz asked Kautsky was, what should we do as socialists vis-a-vis the question of foreign investment in Iran? If foreigners come, like the oil concession is some kind of investment. The British came and built the infrastructure for that. So should we be just out and out opposed to it, or somehow see if we could accommodate that as nationalists, so we're partners in that kind of interaction? And that question was never resolved. The Russians were interested in Iranian oil. They're always interested in concessions in the north of Iran. And the Americans were interested in oil concessions as a third party. They knew there's this tug of war between the British and the Russians, but they wanted to get in, and they finally got in after the 1953 coup. People on the left, the Tudeh party, had a very confused policy on this, because at first they were saying, well, if the British have the concession in the south, let the Soviets have the concession in the north. And their argument was, well, both foreign countries have an interest in this, but the Soviet interest, because they're socialists, would conform better to our national interest. That was more or less the kind of argument. And then they realized that that didn't fly. So they backtracked on, they supported eventually Mossadegh's idea that no, oil in all of Iran should be nationalized, no concessions. So
But the accountability of, okay, who we give concessions to, that's a secondary. I mean, but how much is coming in, where it's going. And I'm surprised even today, the people of Iran don't care. They don't care what's happening under the Islamic Republic. No one's asking how much oil did we sell to the West and where did the money go and how much money was it during the Shah's period. No one asks, how much was, and you do the audit. You say how much did Reza Shah spend on the railroad system, the upgrade of the country, the schools, and there's a deficit. Where did all those deficits go? And it's accepted in our culture. It goes somewhere. That's the most critical point of this whole question about Iran. What do foreigners, of course, a geopolitical position, but in the last century, as you mentioned, Iran is no longer a buffer. Iran is a source of oil. It's a very important piece of this geopolitical puzzle, and we're missing the amount and the dollar amounts. And even up to today, I see opposition. I see Mr. Reza Pahlavi talking about this regime. He talks about human rights, which is great, women's rights, which is great. But what about talking about the things that matter? Is the money, that things that are going to matter to this government, because they weren't able to pursue other avenues of pressuring this government. But where's the money? I mean, Americans say it's the money, stupid, but we still haven't figured it out. And I don't see anybody asking these questions. I don't see any analytical report of the oil. I don't see anything. And our records have disappeared and nobody's asking for them. I don't see anybody in academia saying, where's the oil numbers from 1953 to 78? I don't see anybody. And they all assume, it was under control. The government was controlled. Who was controlling it? It was a handful of people, and they're dead now.
Yeah. I can't answer that because, you have to be an economist. That has to be some of your expertise to know how they run an economy. You're talking about.
I'm sorry about that though. I've heard that answer before. I'm not an economist, and I don't need the details of how much was the GDP was spent and how much was this and that and that. But as a layperson, I'd like to know where those sources are. Our sources are missing. Our sources are missing that as an economist, yeah, of course, we got to put our best economists, accountants, auditing accountants on this project. But where are they going to go?
You're asking for accountability. You're asking for someone to come forward and say, this is how much oil we sold, this is how much income we took, this is how we spend it.
I'm talking about the theft of a nation's wealth for a century, that it's not just accountability, it's a little bit more than that. And how come we're not up in arms? Again, I'm not going into the details of it. How come we're not all as upset about this as we should be?
I don't know, but I think it's part of ordinary people, not just in Iran, but anywhere. Do you think that the ordinary American understands or cares about how the budget of this country is set, how much of it goes to military, how much of it goes to...
Of course not the ordinary, but there are people that are there trying to, audit things, and they know how much our debt is. Of course, this is not a perfect system we're in. If there was a foreign power, taking the oil, the wealth of U.S., there'd be some people looking into it. And again, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I just, as an academic, as part of the opposition, I just want to see, have you felt any kind of an urgency to understand this from any source?
No, but the whole oil nationalization movement in some ways was about that. It was about, this is a national wealth, and Iran, first of all, Iran should have full sovereignty. That was Mossadegh's argument. Now, rightly or wrongly, some may argue that he was pushing this too far, and And in Iran at the time, there was not enough of a strong kind of a political will to exercise the kind of full sovereignty Mossadegh was pushing for. And this is the argument that says he should have compromised to some extent. I don't know, but I would say that yes, that's a period when you see this very strong art, and it's very popular that people supported that yes, we should be sovereign over this, not this foreign company. After that, it gets complicated. Under the Shah, he's the one who makes the final
It's not the
decisions.
foreign companies.
No,
The foreign countries were paying the money. It's our own
right.
governments which were keeping the country in the dark about how much. And again, I'm not attacking Reza Shah. I'm not attacking Shah. I'm not attacking the Islamic Republic. I'm just saying ourselves, we need to ask that question. It needs to come into the vocabulary of the opposition. It needs to come into vocabulary of the Iranian people living in Iran right now. Is where's our money going? Because there's a lot of back deals. There's a lot of cash deals. There's a lot of people getting extremely wealthy off Iranian oil today, and it's happened for 100 years. I just anyway.
No, you're right.
Let's talk about, we're talking about oil. Let's talk about the 1935 deal that Reza Shah makes to the British. I've looked at this many ways. I've looked at a lot of books, a lot of analysis and research of it. A lot of people claim that as Reza Shah's victory because, supporters of him, the concessions, and he got millions from the British, and he revamped the country. But when looking at apples and apples, you put these two deals together, we would have been way better under the 1901 Darcy concession. We had ownership of the refineries and the Palayishgahs. Iran had direct control of it, ownership of it. We had a better profit sharing agreement. And I guess when you compare it, it seems like, if dollar to dollar, we got like 30% to the dollar on the original oil deal that we had. Again, I've seen both sides of it. I've talked to supporters of him and say, well, what choice did he have at that time? The country was cash poor. It was the start of his regime. He needed to make a deal. He needed to get the oil flowing. He needed to get investment coming. But talk about that deal. Analyze it. How was it? Was it to the benefit of our country? Did we not have a choice? Was it just a deal of expediency?
Yeah, I don't know. I have no kind of expertise on that question. But what I have seen is most sources say basically what you said, that even if it was an improvement, it wasn't much of an improvement. So some say, no, it was a setback, but no one claims that deal was really a significant breakthrough. If it were, then we wouldn't have had the issue of oil nationalization that came later. But another problem with that is, again, it was like a one-man decision. Did they refer that question to the Majlis, which was, by the way, also handpicked? It was like dress. It was not a real parliament. So whatever decision that was, the real question is, was it a good thing that one man would make that decision as it was under the Shah? No, it wasn't a good decision that one person would. The famous story that at some point he gets angry and he throws the thing in the fire to burn, as if that changes anything. That's just a copy. That doesn't mean anything. The vital question is, why should this one man have that kind of a power to make that decision wrongly or rightly? And under the Shah, again, is that one man. You could say Iran had more leverage as a result of the Mossadegh era, and the benefit went to the Shah. Under the Islamic Republic, it becomes much more complicated because the way the economy functions, even, yes, under the Shah, it was complicated. I'm not saying that there was total transparency and we know everything. But right now, again, I'm not an economist, but what I read is everyone agrees that things are opaque. Who is really doing what? What kind of deals or kickbacks are going on? What role do the Pasdaran play in Iran? These things we're in the dark. It's in the shadows. And so what can an ordinary person who is persecuted because of their hijab have an opinion on these things? I'm not saying this to, um, absolve people of seriously thinking about the country's problems, as you're saying. But these are like far too complicated. People in Iran are deprived of the most elementary ways of participating in politics. Where the money is going is way beyond that.
You'd think that would be the number one source, the Achilles heel that we would touch, but there's a lot of social issues that I guess affect people more directly. One more question about this period. We hear from different sources how close Reza Shah was to the Germans. We just had a long talk with Professor Oliver Bast. He explains this period and the influence of the Russians there and the Germans there. And there was something to it. And we know at the same time, as you mentioned, the periodicals and the papers for the Social Democrats in Berlin, and there was a strong influence there. Tell us to what level was this, that was one of the reasons that the Reza Shah was forced to abdicate, his closeness with the Germans. How real was that?
Well, I think it was pretty real. And you could see it as even if Reza Shah tried to align himself with the British and not go against their interests, because there was a limit to, even if he wanted to, there was a limit to how far he could push, for example, on the issue of oil, because the British are the stronger party on this. But you could see gravitating towards Germany as, again, looking for, Iran has been facing the Russians and the British. Here's like a third party rising strong in Europe, and they can offer Iran kind of technological expertise. And why not the trade with Germany increases? I don't see it, and I haven't seen scholarly sources tying that to any kind of a serious identification with Nazi ideology. To the extent that it was what the Nazis were saying, that, Aryans and this and that, that may have played a secondary part, because I remember now I was reading some scholarship that Nazis officially were hesitant they were not willing to give Iranians a pass as to being Aryans. They were specifically asked to Iranians treat them as Aryans, and they were exactly like, well, we're not so sure. So I don't think Reza Shah's gravitating towards Germany, increasing trade, kind of politically maybe kind of tilting that way, as an indication of Nazi ideology making an impact, even though, yes, in a broad sense, there's some kind of, Aryanism and all of that was there. But I think it was more like gravitating towards a third power that was clearly the rising power in Europe. And Reza Shah wasn't wrong. I mean, Germany, when the Allies invaded Iran, Germany came very close to have defeated the Soviet Union, and they would have reached Iran. So there was something there. I think it's more like geopolitical than ideological.
Let's move forward. Reza Shah abdicates. His son comes to power. The British, the Russians, and the Americans occupy Iran. 2 years later, at the end of the war, British and the Americans vacate. The Russians occupy, through third parties, Azerbaijan and part of Kurdistan, Mahabad. Discuss the foreign occupation and how it affected the Iranians. Go forward to the fact that the Russians have decided to take parts of Iran, and the Iranian Communist Party sides with them to a greater degree. How does this affect how the Iranian people look at the Communist Party going forward, and how that distrust lasts till today?
Yeah, very badly. It affects the left very badly. But I want to backtrack a little bit and look at that moment of the occupation of Iran first, even before the Americans come, in the summer of 1941, when Reza Shah is forced to abdicate. there's a moment of hesitation of what should they do in his place, and there's a discussion of maybe Iran should be declared a republic that comes up, and the Soviets more or less defer to what the British want, and they, in consultation with Iranians like Muhammad Ali Foroughi, they decide to maintain monarchy. Uh, then that's an interesting kind of turning point, because again, one could say, had they opted for a republic, things could have been different in the long run. A monarchy, as the Shah, when the young Shah, he was only 21 when they made him monarch. He had no power. He was a figurehead. Uh, but what happened was uh, a weak constitutional government was allowed to function because that seemed to be in the best interest of the occupying powers. Because at that moment, there is this anti-fascist front between the British and the Russians, who used to be erstwhile enemies. But now Churchill is a buddy and ally of Stalin, because if Stalin is defeated, so would be the British would also go under. So everything, the fate of the world kind of hangs around Stalingrad in 1 year. And so they are allies. And when the Americans join, they're also allies. So somehow in Iran, you have this situation where anti-fascism is the order of the day. Is supported by the Soviets, is supported by the Americans, is supported by the British. And each one of them have their constituencies in the country. The British have their old conservative Majlis deputies and corrupt politicians that they control. The Americans don't have anyone really yet, and from the get-go, they support on the armed forces. They support on the gendarmerie, and they support on training Iranian officers. They're clever. They know what they're doing. They know where, in the long run, push comes to shove, it's the military that's important. So the rebuilding, the Shah's army collapses. So putting it together, the U.S. is really concerned and involved with that, and they have a plan. They're not just doing this randomly. The Soviets then put their support behind this new party called the Tudeh Party. And we have to understand that when the Tudeh Party was formed, it's an anti-fascist, constitutionalist, and nationalist party. And both the Soviets and the British supported. The British supported the Tudeh Party early on for kind of interesting reasons. One of the reasons was, you read the British sources, and they are worried that Iran may be at the brink of a revolution. So if you have a manageable reformist party, you have a manageable left party that is not too radical, and it's on our side, and it's also on the Soviet side, that's not a bad idea. So I think the Tudeh Party starts out, you could see it as auspicious beginnings. You could see it as the convergence of these global forces. That's not a bad moment for a revival of a constitutional government. The only time we really had the most sustained period of constitutional government in Iran is between 1941 and 1953. As imperfect and corrupt and kind of confused as it was, we haven't had anything like that. And then you have freedom of the press, expression. Yes, as you said, these journalists are selling their services to the highest bidder. All of that exists. But then this party plays a very important role in the sense of not so much coming to power through a parliamentary presence, but in the sense of, this is the moment where being an intellectual, being an educated people, is synonymous with being a Tudei. You look at the roster of all of the most important, perhaps all of them, of Iran's intellectual, the educated people, the university students, their professors. This is something that all sources agree to. They're all today's. Why? Because, again, this is like the time of the constitutional revolution, because there is no other alternative. I mean, an alternative is Said Zia. Said Zia comes back, and he is like is a branded British agent. Dr. Mossadegh is there, but Mossadegh was, and I think this is one of his weaknesses in the long run. He was not, he was a parliamentarian, but a one-man show parliamentarian. He did not affiliate with political parties. And this in the long run is going to help bring him down. Um, Most closely associated with Iran Party, which was a small socialist party. But really, the only, and again, this is not my take, you read most sources of the time and afterward, the only political party in Iranian history that has reached to some kind of a popular base. Today also organized the Iranian working class. There were today affiliated unions. Hundreds of thousands of workers were organized, including oil workers in the south. So it was very successful because it had a program. The program was revived the old program of the Democrat Party. It was constitutionalist. It was moderately socialist. The Tudeh Party significantly was pushing for women's right to vote, and no other party was demanding that at that time. So the reason why it's successful is that it has a program, and that program has traction. It was not, sometimes people say the Tudeh Party was a Soviet instrument. In the end, I think the big mistake of the Tudeh was they allowed themselves to become that. But they didn't start out that way. And the reason why there's so many defections or splits from them is that Tudehis who realize they don't want to follow the Soviet Union, they want to be Marxist or communist, whatever they call themselves, independently for themselves, they could not last in that party. They had to either exit or become like an opposition, like the Khalil Maliki group. And that, the big split happened over what you mentioned, over the question of Azerbaijan. And we have to do a little bit of a fast forward here, because by the time that crisis happened, we have to remember that the Tudeh Party is Iran's only real political party with mass popular support, a lot of support among intellectuals. And then here comes, by the end of the war, then the occupying powers have signed an agreement with the Iranian government that the war is over, we leave the country. And the Americans and the British do, but the Soviet Union refuses. Stalin refuses to pull out the Red Army, and they support, or basically, I think we can say that mostly through Soviet Azerbaijan, they bring to power the government of Pishevari, Ferghe Demokrat Azerbaijan. And this is also even a slap in the face of the Tudeh Party, because they cut off the strongest branch of the Tudeh Party was this in Azerbaijan branch. But when the Soviet Union decides to support an autonomous government in Azerbaijan, they cut off the Tudeh Party's branch in Azerbaijan, and they recruited into the autonomous government. And so there's an autonomous government formed there, which it never asked for independence or secession from Iran. But it was asking, the argument was something like what had happened in Azerbaijan before, that the rest of Iran is under reaction. Azerbaijan is this progressive part of Iran that is going to liberate the rest of the country. And the autonomous government also did some things that everyone in retrospect, or even at the time, said these are legitimate demands. For example, they wanted education in Turkish, in Azeri. They opened a university there. They gave women the right to vote in Azerbaijan. So some of the things they did were quite popular. They also initiated land reform. And at some points, this became kind of violent and revolutionary. Like people, peasants were, the Red Army was backing them, so they would go and seize land. So what they were doing, in some ways, were a continuation of Iran's revolutionary tradition. The problem or difficulty is that they can do all of this because the Red Army is there. They wouldn't think that, okay, what happens if tomorrow Stalin pulls out his forces? Can we sustain this on our own? Obviously, they couldn't, because we know what happened. What happens is, once again, I think this is fair to say, that the Soviet leadership sacrificed the Iranian communists that really worked for them. Qavam is not, people sometimes think that Truman gave an ultimatum. They didn't. Actually, they did in the UN, they asked for Soviet withdrawal because they had signed a treaty to withdraw, and they're dragging their feet. But who got them out was the clever Prime Minister Qavam.
Silver Fox.
Yes, the clever fox.
And Mossad did at the same time. They worked in conjunction.
They told that
Majlis.
they negotiated with them. Qavam was very clever. First of all, he created a counterfeit political party. He took 3 Tudeh ministers into his cabinet. He was kind of tilting to the left, or a left posture, and he created a party, called it the Democrat Party. These names are important. And in it, he kind of copied the program of the Tudeh party, and he negotiated a deal with Stalin that, okay, you guys pull out, and we will consider an oil concession. And of course, the Majlis said no to the oil concession.
They had passed a law that unless foreign forces vacate the country, no concession
Yes,
can be
and
given.
Mossadegh was, no, we can't negotiate anything until all of this is ended.
And is it true that the Russians were okay with that, because they figured if we can't have concessions up north, this law is going to take effect in the south with the British eventually?
Well,
Like after they went after the northern concessions, you knew they were going to go after the southern concessions.
the northern concession was a new one that Iran was not going to give, but the British concession, getting rid of it was going to be very difficult, and as we know, it was an enormous task when it happened. So I think, again, they left, and the Iranian government sent its troops into Azerbaijan, and there was like bloody massacre there. But yes, and the people who, Pishevari and others, I think, I'm sorry to say, yes, they were played by Stalin and by the Azerbaijan Communist Party leadership. They had to flee, and they had to leave their supporters behind to pay the price, and it was a huge blow to the Tudeh and to the Iranian left. Yet again, now, if you don't want to call it a betrayal, it's clear that they let themselves be used and abused by Moscow, and they did not show independence of judgment. I mean, you would like to see a Tudeh leadership who says, no, we're not, you said you're going to evacuate Iran, you evacuate Iran. We're leftist, we stick to our principles, we're constitutionalist, but that was not the leadership of the Tudeh party. And that event, by the way, caused a major split in the Tudeh party. So you could say, I know that Khalil Maliki and his socialist faction have been criticized for all kinds of things, for their Tudeh position leading to an anti-communist position, sometimes bringing them so close to the American side. At some point, just before the 1953 coup happens, Maliki says the greatest danger to Iran is not the Americans and the British, it's the Tudeh party. He was going too far there. But he leads a strand in Iranian left that is Marxist and socialist, but independent of the Soviet Union. And that's an important trend that needs to be recognized, that not all Iranian leftists or communists, again, uh, were in agreement on the same thing. By the way, though, even after the Azerbaijan debacle, the Tudeh party, as now a clearly branded Stalinist party, revived itself, and it even increased its membership. It's not like, that was not the end of the Tudeh party. Despite that, it was able to rebound and continue to be the leading party in Iran.
Professor Matin-Asgari, I really appreciate you sitting here with us, talking us through this period. We've kind of reached 1942. We went through the constitutional period, World War I, Reza Shah, up to this point, and we don't have enough time today to continue, but I would like to continue this conversation of the role of the left during the oil nationalization in relation with support for Mossadegh during the period of the Shah, the radicalization, 1979, the revolution, and going forward. You've agreed to come back and talk to us, and I look forward to our discussion.
Sure. Even though the topic is not always uplifting, at times tragic, it would be a pleasure to continue.
Well, I really think this is an important side of our history that we need to understand. There's no way to understand the situation we are in today with the current regime. There's no way to understand 1979, the revolution. There's no way to understand any part of our history without this aspect of it, and we appreciate your insight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.